Okay, so to begin this discussion, we will start with the different divisions of the peripheral nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system. So we'll start with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, and then we'll compare it with the somatic. So we'll start with those three. So we'll go up here and it'll all make sense. So first, we have the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is divided up into sensory and motor pathways, but we will only focus on motor today. So motor can be divided up into somatic and autonomic. Somatic is basically dealing with skeletal muscles, so things we can control, but we won't really talk too much about that. We'll talk about it a little bit, but we won't go too much into depth. And then the other one is autonomic. So autonomic is things, I like to think of automatic when I think of autonomic. This is basically just things that happen automatically without us trying. So like it deals with cardiac muscles or smooth muscles or glands or various things like that. And then the autonomic can be divided up into a few more sections, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic and the enteric, but we won't talk too much about the enteric today. So parasympathetic, sympathetic, and somatic is where we'll focus our attention first. So with the somatic, so this little body right here originates in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and it just has one neuron, and then it just goes to wherever it's affecting the skeletal muscle. So it's just got one big long one. If we come down over here, we can see a little better diagram. So yes, we see the somatic right here. It's got one big long one, and then we'll go into cholinergic neurons and what those mean later. But briefly, well, just to explain it now real quick, that means that it's going to release this acetylcholine neurotransmitter, and that makes this cholinergic. Anyway, and then this also has N1 receptors on the target, as opposed to what we'll see with the parasympathetic and sympathetic. And we'll go into the receptors a little later, but that is somatic. So innervates skeletal muscles. It's cholinergic. It's just got one big long one. It starts, same thing like these, starts in the spinal cord. And yeah. So now moving on to the parasympathetic. So the parasympathetic, it's characterized by a longer preganglionic neuron, and that just means this first neuron as opposed to the second one. So this one's longer. That's how we can recognize it. One way we can recognize it. And then the second one is shorter. Vice versa with the sympathetic. Sympathetic preganglionic is shorter, and then this post one is a little longer. So one interesting thing, another thing to separate them and distinguish them, is that all of the preganglionic neurons are cholinergic. In other words, they release acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is released, that makes it cholinergic. And they both have N2 receptors on this second little cell body that starts this postganglionic neuron. So they both have N2 receptors, and that stands for nicotinic. So a nicotinic receptor. And I think we'll go into that a little bit later as well too. So that's that. The second little neuron right here, so this postganglionic neuron on this parasympathetic pathway, that is also cholinergic. So in other words, it releases acetylcholine to its effector organ or wherever it's going, as opposed to sympathetic postganglionic, which is adrenergic. And adrenergic basically means that something like norepinephrine or epinephrine is going to be released. So that's what adrenergic means, is that it's not going to release acetylcholine like all of these, but it's going to release a little something different. Okay, so these both originate in the lateral horn. So we'll come up here for a second. So we can see this sympathetic pathway is kind of looking at these mainly. So we can see it's also known as the thoracolumbar pathway, or and that's because it starts all these little cell bodies. They start at T1 and they can be found all the way down through L2, the L2 vertebrae. So that's where these are found. The parasympathetic over here is just found in a few different places. So it's found in the cranial areas. So all these cranial nerves, we won't worry about those, but that's head and neck anatomy and stuff. But this one, this vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, is very important, and it contains a very, very large amount of, well, as you can see, it's got all these different things that it goes to. So it's got a lot of different pathways. And it's also got this little sacral area down here. So this is also known as the craniosacral kind of pathway, because we got cranial and sacral. So that little gap in the middle that we were looking at, so this little gap, so those synapses. And synapses so sympathetic pathway can synapse in two different places. It can synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglia, which can be seen up above right here. Or it can go straight through the chain ganglia and go to the collateral ganglia, where it can synapse there. So, and then, well, there's actually another place. So there's this one pathway that we see down here, number 4. It's where we got the preganglionic. It doesn't synapse. It goes to the collateral ganglia, and even there it doesn't synapse. And then finally it goes to the medulla of the adrenal gland, which can be seen right there. So that's kind of responsible for things like raising our heart rate a little bit, because it goes directly into the blood. It releases these excitatory things directly into the blood. So that is a very important pathway. But as far as synapsing elsewhere, the only other places are going to be the sympathetic chain ganglia and the collateral ganglia. And these are the 4 pathways. I don't think we need to go too much into those, but it just kind of shows where it synapses, like here, collateral, here, sympathetic chain ganglia. And then just different pathways go to the skin, the blood, thoracic cavity, abdominal pelvic cavity. So those are the 4 main pathways for the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system can synapse in really just one place, and that's in the terminal ganglia. So that is the only place that the parasympathetic can synapse. And that's kind of why it's characterized by longer preganglionic, because it really could just synapses where it's going. So that's what that means. They both can innervate lots of different things, but one important distinction, they can innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, lots of different things, but one important thing to remember is that parasympathetic does not innervate blood vessels. That is one important thing to remember. Another important fact is that if the sympathetic pathway synapses in the sympathetic chain ganglia, we automatically know it's going to one of these 3 places. It's going to erector pili, that controls our hair follicles. It's going to sweat glands, or it's going to blood vessels. So that is another important thing about those. Let me go check if I covered everything for that part. So comparing contrast includes such things as the point of origin. We did that. Number of neurons. Yeah, so the sympathetic and parasympathetic have 2, and that somatic just has 1. Location of the ganglia. We did that. Neurotransmitters. And okay. So now we'll go into some more of the neurotransmitters and the types of receptors that receive those neurotransmitters and what they do. So if we look here, so there's 3 main pathways that we can look at. So with the sympathetic, we'll look at this pathway and this pathway. So we see just what we saw earlier. Sympathetic, they have these synapses right here. They're both cholinergic. And then, so we'll start with this one down here. So one of the sympathetic pathways is that it goes to sweat glands. It controls a lot of our sweat glands, our generalized sweat glands. So as opposed to what we were talking about earlier, where this postganglionic typically has the norepinephrine, this one that goes to sweat glands is actually also cholinergic. So it both has they both have this acetylcholine being released. And then this one is norepinephrine. And again, those are the ones like epinephrine, but the main ones we'll look at is norepinephrine and epinephrine. They're very similar, and acetylcholine. So with this sweat gland pathway, there's these different receptors. So there's all these different receptors right here. So alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1 through 3, D1 and 2, there's all these M receptors, all these M odd. So we'll explain what that means. So the alpha and beta, obviously we know there's alpha and beta, that's what that means. We won't worry too much about these because those go to the brain. We didn't talk too much about that, but these are called muscarinic receptors. And then, again, same thing down here. So the M receptors, I'll start with this. So if it's an odd number, it means it's excitatory. If it's even, it means it's inhibitory. So we know that parasympathetic is rest and digest. That's the main things it'll deal with. And sympathetic is fight or flight. So if, like, say, for example, we have an odd thing on this sympathetic pathway. Let's take beta 1, for example. So we know it's odd, so it's excitatory. So we know it's going to have to do something with helping us in a fight or flight situation. Now, if we're looking at the even one, then we know that it's going to be dealing with something inhibitory. So like, for example, the lungs. So we know that B2 has to deal a lot with the lungs. And if it's inhibitory, it means it's inhibiting something. So in this case, in the lungs, we need to open our airways. And so what happens is that this inhibitory receptor is going to go and do its function and open our airways, which is an inhibitory action, which ends up helping us in the sympathetic, in a fight or flight situation. So different receptors do different things. Here's a basic list. So the lungs are primarily B2 or beta 2. Blood vessels are alpha 1. Heart is beta 1. General sweat glands are M odd, just like we were looking at right there. M odd. And then the eye actually has 2, one that constricts and one that dilates. So again, with sweat glands, it's the M odd. With parasympathetic pathways, it's M1 through 5. Again, that contains both inhibitory and excitatory receptors. And then here we get, again, a mix of inhibitory and excitatory. And they are going to help in, whatever situation is needed. So if it's fight or flight, or rest and digest. And again, these receptors are only capable of receiving this acetylcholine. Same here. But here, these are only capable of receiving norepinephrine or epinephrine. So again, very specific, and we can only really have one at a time for each. It's not like we have all of these. These just go to different areas. These are all the possible ones for this sympathetic pathway. Other little facts: epinephrine strongly stimulates beta 2 receptors, and norepinephrine strongly stimulates alpha 1. So basically, what happens in each of these pathways. So we'll take the muscarinic, for example, first. So the muscarinic receptors, again, these are cholinergic pathways or cholinergic receptors. So these cholinergic receptors are going to, whenever there's a synapse, like here and here, here and here, we have to convert an electrical signal. So all these positive charges, this Wong coming down, we have to convert that electrical signal into a chemical signal. So synapses, which we learned earlier, we didn't cover too much in this little section of this essay question. But in a synapse, things are going to come down. That positive charge is going to make calcium flow in. It's going to release these neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are going to bind to these receptors and open up more ion channels, which allows that action potential to just continue going to wherever it needs to go. But when it gets to the target here, it's going to have to deal with certain G proteins. So G proteins are basically things that when it gets activated, so when these ion channels are open from the receptor or from the neurotransmitter, ion channels open, and those ion channels go and activate G proteins. And G proteins are basically what go and do the functions. So they regulate things like cyclic AMP, and they just go and do their functions. So that's what happens with as far as the mechanism for what happens here. With here, it's basically the same thing. But again, adrenergic receptors, so a little bit of a different pathway. So this neurotransmitter is going to bind, and it's going to, again, activate G proteins to go and do their function. And again, whether that's excitatory or inhibitory with even numbers, depends on the situation. Okay, let me make sure I got all that. Here are things that bind to adrenergic receptors. They're called catecholamines. It's norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. So again, different from cholinergic, those are adrenergic, and those are classified by catecholamines. Okay, let me double check that. So types of receptors, actions. Cholinergic, adrenergic, different subdivisions. Yes, so we talked about all the different receptors with the alpha, beta, muscarinic. Those are the different subdivisions of each that we talked about. And we talked about the mechanisms. Okay, well, let me double check everything, but I believe that will about do it for this week's essay.